So I wanted to start by asking a question of everybody here, which is just, do you guys know when the first human being landed on the moon? 1969. And do you, any of the three of you, know when the last human being landed on the moon?
78.
72. So human beings only walked on the moon for a 3-year period, 1969 to 1972. Which is really quite incredible when you consider that the space race only started in 1957. So it took 12 years to go from the first human being in orbit, Yuri Gagarin, that's 12 years from the first orbital launch of Sputnik 1 in 1957, first human being in 1961 in orbit, Yuri Gagarin, 12 years from the first orbital launch, 8 years from the first human being in orbit to the first human being on the moon. Really incredible speed of progress in that period. And yet 3 years later, it ended. Since then, we've never gone back. We've just stayed in low Earth orbit, never progressed to human spaceflight beyond the peak achieved in 1969, or in the Apollo program between those 3 or 4 years. Why did that happen? If you go back to the 1960s and 1970s and look at literature and look at paintings and artworks that were done at that time about spaceflight and about the future generally, there was an impression at the time that the future was going to be this technological wonderland. There's this impression of the kind of Jetsons future or the 2001 A Space Odyssey future, if you've ever seen that movie. The idea that by the 1990s and 2000s you'd just be able to go up to an airport and board a space plane that would take you to a lunar colony. We'd have people on Mars. We'd have flying cars everywhere. It's, health scanners, pills that give you a whole meal, this kind of vision of the future that they had in the 1960s. That just completely failed to materialize. And the world that we did instead get has had significant progress in one area only, really, technologically speaking, which is computing. Aside from computing, a lot of other areas of technology just basically ground to a halt from about the 1960s, 1970s onwards. The progress you see since then is all because of computing. It's all things that computer modeling and that kind of computer-assisted design have made possible. Otherwise, you see no progress in space flight, really, besides robotic exploration and deep-range telescope work, but there's no progress in human spaceflight until very recently, and it's starting to change again now. Now, why that happened is an interesting question, and part of it is that the reason the Apollo program was able to happen, the reason that the moon landings happened so quickly, is because it was a national prestige project. There was the desire on the part of both the Russian and American governments at the time, or Soviet and American governments at the time, to outdo each other. And all of the nation's resources were piled into these programs. Now, the Russians were in the lead for a long time. The Soviet program got there first for the first orbital launch, the first human in space, the first human spacewalk, the first docking of 2 spacecraft in orbit. All of these major milestones that came up to the moon landing, the Russians got there first. But their lunar program fell short in a number of ways. They cut a lot of corners. They kept firing people who disagreed with the state's idea of how it should be done. Leading scientists, leading managers were cut from the program. And they didn't have the wealth and the resources of a market economy to draw on, whereas the Americans did. The Americans had Lockheed Martin and companies like that innovating, producing, and they listened a lot more to their managers. So ultimately, the Americans got there first. The Russian program was a complete disaster. Their moon rocket crashed 4 times and never flew. So, but once that achievement was achieved, once America made it to the moon, the goal was done. And the Apollo program cost in 2023 dollars, $301 billion US dollars, if it were translated into today's money. Extraordinary amount of money. And that program was not designed to be commercially viable in the long run. It was not geared towards sustainability. It was geared towards achieve this goal, win that battle, and done. And there's another program from the same period that exhibits the same problem. If you look at the Concorde project, which was a British-French joint venture to create the first commercial passenger supersonic jetliner. Again, inordinately expensive project, successfully created its product, a really quite a good product. Concorde's a quite amazing piece of technology, but it was never commercially viable. It had a very low passenger capacity, it guzzled fuel like nobody's business, it was very expensive to operate, and only the state-run airlines of the 2 countries that developed it ever bought it. They tried to sell it other places, nobody wanted it. It ended up finding this little niche, just carrying extremely wealthy people between London, Paris, and New York, and nothing else. The price, I have it down here somewhere, round trip ticket average on Concorde was $12,000 if you just wanted to go to New York and back on it. So that was the only niche they could make it remotely viable on. Again, both of these projects, both state-run enterprises, both designed to achieve national prestige. Neither of them was designed with the goal of commercial viability. Now, in the 1970s, you see both NASA and Roscosmos, the Russian space agency, you see them both starting to realize this problem, and that if they want to keep spaceflight going, it needs to become more commercially viable. And they both tried to do that. And the Americans came up with the space shuttle. You might be familiar with the look of that. It's a big white plane anchored to an orange tank with 2 boosters on the side. Sort of became the definitive idea of what a rocket looks like in its time. Which the idea of the space shuttle was you make it reusable. So instead of the rocket getting thrown away after every launch and build a new one for the next launch, which is how it always worked before that, the shuttle, it lands, you can clean it up and launch it again effectively. But unfortunately, again, all sorts of things went wrong in the development of that program. The shuttle was designed to operate 50 flights a year over a 10-year period. Instead, it cost 30 times its original budget and only ever flew 135 flights in its 30-year lifetime. So why did that happen? Very quickly, because there's a short version of this talk. A big part of the problem was that there's really 2 main issues. One is that private companies were contracting with the state. So instead of being directly accountable for their own results, like if a company invests in something and it's just doing it for itself, then if that thing fails, it's just lost that money. In these state contracts, the responsibility was not on the people doing the work, it was on NASA, and they were contracting out. And the companies wanted to obviously make a profit on that, and the problem is, because they knew it was a government project and they were going to get funded regardless of whatever they did, they inflated their profit margins enormously. So to try and stop that, the government imposed this 5 or 10% limit on company profits, and then they made their processes as inefficient as possible so that 5 or 10% would be as big as possible. So you have companies that understand that the government's just going to do this project regardless of whether it's commercially viable or not. And you had a lot of very inefficient processes arising out of that. The other problem, and the really fundamental problem with government-run space programs and other programs like Concorde, is that to get their funding, all that the agencies need to do is convince government politicians to fund them. And they do that by all sorts of ways. You can see this with projects like HS2 now, or the California High-Speed Rail is even worse for this, where they're not justifying the project in terms of the actual long-term commercial benefits it will bring. They're justifying it in terms of the jobs it will create, how it will help local constituencies, will it create jobs in this area, will it bring investment to this area. And ultimately, these projects are inefficient by design. They're designed to create job opportunities, create economic activity in a specific area, but without any wider vision in terms of whether the end product's going to be useful or actually going to be advantageous to anyone. So the shuttle ended up failing. Russia's attempts to commercialize were similar. They tried to make the Mir space station into a tourist destination. It was just far too expensive to operate like that. What's happened in the last 10 years, though, is we've had a really significant change in spaceflight, which is that companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin and Orbital Sciences and dozens of these companies have come along and started trying to make spaceflight commercially viable. This is a completely new thing, and it's only happened really recently because since the end of the space shuttle in 2011, the US hasn't had a serious manned space program, and it still doesn't at the moment. It's had to go to private companies to try and do this. And what SpaceX has done under Elon Musk's leadership, and Elon Musk is a complicated character, and there's all sorts of problems I have with things he says on Twitter, but he's certainly a man with a vision, and he had a very clear vision of wanting to make human spaceflight a reality. And he recognized that the way to do that is to make it commercially viable. And so he set himself the mission of creating the cheapest launch system, the most commercially viable launch system ever. And he did that with the Falcon rocket. And the Falcon rocket is different from the space shuttle because it's far more reusable. The space shuttle still had components that had to be thrown away, like the external fuel tank, and to land and relaunch the shuttle, you had to completely replace all the tiles on the bottom of it, completely re-engineer the whole thing. It took months. It was a very lengthy process. Falcon was rigorously designed to be as reusable as possible, and in order to achieve that, SpaceX innovated all sorts of new ways of making it reusable. Most notable and interesting, I think, is the way that the boosters from the Falcon landed themselves back on the launch pad after they detach from the rocket. So that it's very difficult to balance a thing on a single point of thrust when you're trying to land it, but they invented and trialed through several failures a way of doing that. One other reason, very quickly by the way, that SpaceX has been more successful than NASA in developing new launch systems is because they're willing to accept failure. They recognize that to achieve a goal you have to go through failure. And NASA has again, very government oversight mindset of nothing can ever go wrong. We don't launch until we know it's going to be perfect. SpaceX just builds the rocket, says, let's try it, oh, it blew up, what went wrong? Let's try again, oh, it blew up, what went wrong? And they just go through that process until it works. And they just go straight. They want to get to commercial operations as quickly as possible. What you've seen as a result of that now is that it's cheaper than ever to launch human beings and payloads into space. The Falcon its per launch cost of $67 million. It is less than the space shuttle's originally intended launch cost. And the space shuttle ended up more than 10 times more expensive than it was supposed to be per launch. So, and now SpaceX is developing the Starship, which is intended to get that down into the 2 million range, which is a whole nother planet of efficiency in terms of cost. Now, I've been talking a lot about how the state versus private companies are achieving spaceflight, but I want to go back to that original question of that flourishing future that people envisaged in the 1960s and 1970s, and try and bring back the understanding of why spaceflight is important and why we should want to go and why we should want to support people like Elon Musk doing that and making that a reality. And that's that space has enormous potential to improve human flourishing, human lives. And there's all sorts of ways that's true. There's some more obvious ones and some less obvious ones. The more obvious ones are material resources, is a really notable one. For example, the moon is full of helium-3, which is an isotope of helium that doesn't naturally occur on Earth. It could be really useful for nuclear fusion and other sort of sources of power that are more, I don't like to use the phrase renewable, but have fewer undesirable side products or can generate more energy with less fuel. And there's metal-rich asteroids, things like that, that could massively increase our access to resources, especially without having to disrupt the Earth's crust to get at them. So there's all sorts of benefits from a material point of view. There's just the sheer space of new places for human beings to live. Mars, the moon offer, it sort of is a planet B really, if we can make Mars work. And somewhere for us to live, somewhere for us to spread out so that human population can keep growing, people can keep living flourishing lives with more places to do it in. There's the experiential side of it, just the mind-altering element of going to space. If you talk to astronauts, they'll talk a lot about how it changed their perspective on life, on planet Earth, on countries, nations, races, all that kind of stuff. They started seeing the world as a single whole, as humanity as one entity. And it's just that out of the Earth perspective changes people's attitudes to a lot of things, to human life and to the nature of the universe. That kind of experience is something I think we should want people to have, want more people to have access to. And it's worth noting, people attack Bezos and Musk for the fact that at the moment their space tourism is only for the wealthy. But any new technology has to go through that phase. It's the wealthy who pay for things if you want things to become available to less wealthy people in the long run. If I want to go to space, which I do, I need to go through that period of watching wealthy people go to space first so that technology gets developed and funded and paid for and built out. And I think that's a wonderful thing, and I'm really excited that I might get that chance in 20, 30 years' time, even at a moderate income, or if I can certainly build mine up a bit more. So those are more apparent ones, but there are also some slightly less apparent benefits I want to talk about for a minute. One is the effect of frontiers on human societies. So if you look at the American West, the frontier of the 19th century, people living in that environment, and this is true of the Americas as a whole, because Europeans moving to America found a very different geographic environment to what they were used to, much harsher, much more challenging terrain, especially in the West in the desert. And living in that environment, you had to deal with reality on a daily basis. You couldn't carry over the same irrational ideas that you had back in Europe. So when you're in a small Western town, and there's only a few people around, and you're in the middle of nowhere, you don't have resources coming in and out, you can't deny women the ability to do any job anymore. If you need someone to teach, you need someone to go and drill, build, whatever, you have to be rational and say every human being should be doing whatever they are good at doing. You have to drop some of those irrationalities behind you. And then that applied in all sorts of ways. You have to deal with science, you have to recognize the reality that praying for water isn't going to make it appear, you have to go and find it. And you can't entertain irrationalities anymore in a frontier environment. That's even more true in space.
We have a society now, and this is one of the main points I want to integrate in this talk, we have a society now that is getting more and more anti-science. There's, in two senses, there are people who reject science and just outright reject its conclusions, and there are people who claim to support science that don't actually engage in the scientific method properly and treat it more like a religion. And the true essence of science, of rational inquiry, of asking questions and working out answers about the world, is essential in space. If you live on Mars, you've got to do science. If you want water, if you want to live, if you want air, you need to be science literate. And early Mars colonies are going to have to do that. They're going to have to teach science properly. They're going to have to teach rational thinking, critical thinking. And that's one of the most interesting opportunities for spaceflight, to my mind, is when we start having human beings living in these places, it will be an engine for rational thinking and for changing those sort of attitudes amongst the people who move to those places. Similarly, in the long run, those colonies offer a really interesting opportunity to experiment with new forms of government. And that's the other thing, that's the political connection I want to bring back in, besides the government-run space programs element, which we can talk about more in questions if you want to. But the other political dimension is that it's really important to understand, and I'm sure you guys do from your studies, that the creation of the United States in the 18th century changed world history enormously. It didn't just create the first representational republic, not really counting the Roman Republic as representational, like it didn't just create the first representational republic in human history, it created a model that other countries could then copy from. And it showed Europe of that era, this very backwards, very monarchical, very aristocratic society, that another way was possible. If you read into the American founding, when it was happening, a lot of people in America thought this experiment was going to be a disaster. If we just give ordinary people control over things, we don't have a monarch, it's going to be haywire, moral values will go out the window. And that's what people thought at the time. And then it showed the world that not only does freedom work, but it works better. And you end up with a richer, wealthier society. And within 50 years, you had technologies coming out of the US that wouldn't have existed otherwise. And the freedom we enjoy today, Britain's a bit different because American liberty was built on British ideas to some extent, but the liberty we enjoy in Britain and in the rest of Europe today is in large part inspired by the United States. It created this beacon it's an exemplar of how a government could be run, and it's an imperfect example, and it has a lot that could be better, but it was still light years ahead of the rest of the world in its time. We could do the same thing again if space colonies, these very, like the United States, these environments that encourage reason and rationality, that attract people who are curious and want to improve their lives and want to live in freedom, like the United States did back when it was a free place that encouraged immigration, unlike today. It was a magnet for people who wanted to improve their lives, wherever they came from. If we can create that again in space, we can do that same thing and show the governments of the world today that something better is possible. Because today, all of planet Earth is covered in either very, very large, very controlling governments to varying degrees, but there isn't really a free country in the truest sense anywhere on Earth. Or they're like, the only part of the world that isn't is Antarctica, which is covered by a treaty that says nobody can set up civilization there. Interestingly, one more thing I'll talk about before I conclude is that there's a similar treaty in place for space. I don't know if you're aware of this, but there's a thing called the Outer Space Treaty, which is kind of modeled on the Antarctic Treaty, which rather hubristically, governments of the 1960s said, we're going to make a treaty that applies to the entire universe, all of space besides the Earth. And this treaty says that you can't found nations in space, that space has to be used for the benefit of all mankind, that it must be in the interest of all countries, everything that's done out there. And it's got all these articles, you can read through it, it's available online. But the gist of it is you can't use space for your own country, you can't found your own country, everything has to be universal. And that means you literally can't set up independent nations anywhere in space. If you fly out to Pluto by yourself in your spacecraft you invented in your garage or something, you're breaking the law if you set up your own nation out there, which is kind of mind-bending. And that's going to restrict that ability to innovate. It's going to create these colonies that just exist in this legal vacuum, where they don't belong to one country, but they kind of do, and they belong to a private company, but their rights aren't protected because they're outside their government's influence. And it's going to create all these weird loopholes. There's already been some debates going on. Elon Musk and Joe Biden have both got into this debate about whether Mars colonies are going to be American territory, neutral territory, private land, whatever. There's not a clear legal framework for that at the moment. And I have a concern that if we do found Mars colonies, we're going to have a situation where at some point in the future there's going to be a clash of them wanting to be self-governing and Earth not wanting to let them be self-governing. And a lot of science fiction has explored that concept, but it will be much better for human flourishing if we can actually let those colonies be independent early on and become exemplars of freedom, become exemplars of rationality in our increasingly anti-scientific and irrational society in many respects. So to sort of integrate what I've been saying, and let's say this is a very condensed version of a longer talk, so apologies if it's a bit quick, but the main point I want to make is that human flourishing is, or should be, our way of evaluating whether or not we do something, our moral evaluation, whether or not we go to space, whether or not we have freedom in our country, all those, just on a personal level and on a political level. We should be trying to achieve a more flourishing, more free society. And freedom and flourishing are very integrated. The freer a country is, the wealthier it is, the more people will flourish. The more people flourish, the more people have time to worry about politics, to worry about whether they're free, whether their rights are being protected. The two go together hand in hand. And if we want a more flourishing and more free society, that does mean embracing all of the philosophic principles that underlie freedom and flourishing, which is reason, rationality, respect for human life and individual rights. And we're losing a lot of that at the moment. We're drifting not only away from science and away from critical thinking and away from rational debate, but also away from respect for freedom and for individual rights, and increasingly towards this society of security, of big government, of protectionism in the sense of closing international trade, and also just protection of the state should look after me from the terrorist or from the business people or whatever threat you're perceiving. I think space is a huge tool for pushing against that, for pushing for a more rational worldview. So I would say, to finish, advocate for science, advocate for spaceflight. Also, science fiction is a wonderful tool for thinking about ideas, not just about science, but about politics as well. If you read Robert Heinlein and authors like that, or Isaac Asimov, or even watch Star Trek and shows like that, there's so much research done through fiction into alternative systems of government, into alternative ideas about societies, and I think that's one of the most interesting things about space, is breaking out of our current context in terms of how societies are run, social norms, values, ideas about government, and I'm really excited on the one hand for what space could do for innovating in a new direction for those sorts of things. On the other hand, I just hope it happens quickly enough before we sort of collapse into a new dark age in the West, which I have a bit of a fear might be coming.